Welcome to the channel, Fear of Darkness. Today's story follows two enslaved twin sisters who escaped music into the Wild West and became, against every law of their era, the deadliest bounty hunters the frontier had ever seen. Their names were wiped from the records. Their faces never appeared in a single photograph, but the men who hunted them never forgot. And the men they hunted never survived long enough to warn the others. This is a harsh, intense journey through violence, sisterhood, survival, and transformation. Take a moment, breathe, and listen closely. Before we start, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps ensure these stories are remembered, not erased. Let's begin. In the autumn of 1874, two women rode into Black Hollow, a mining town in the Arizona Territory. They came from the south, out of the Dragoon Mountains, arriving just before sunset when the light turned the desert the color of dried blood. They were dressed identically, long dark coats falling past their knees wide, brimmed hats pulled low over their faces, leather gloves, boots caked with the red dust of 100 driving miles. Each carried a rifle across her saddle and two revolvers on her hips. Each rode as if born in the saddle. They were black, they were women, they were twins. And in the saddlebag of the sister on the left, folded carefully between layers of oiled cloth, was a federal warrant for a man named Cyrus Holloway, wanted alive for murdering a territorial marshal. In New Mexico, the bounty was $800, one of the largest in the region. Cyrus Holloway was drinking in the Silver Vein Saloon when the twin sisters walked through the doors. He was surrounded by 6 armed men, all loyal, all paid. He had hidden in Black Hollow for 4 months, believing himself untouchable. 40 seconds later, 3 of his men lay dead on the saloon floor. 2 were bleeding and begging. 1 had fled through the back window. Cyrus Holloway was on his knees, his wrists tied behind his back with a length of braided rawhide. His mouth bled where a revolver butt had broken 2 of his teeth. The sister on the left leaned close until her face was inches from his. Her voice was calm, almost quiet. "You're going to walk out of this saloon on your own feet, Mr. Holloway. You're going to ride with us back to Santa Fe. And when they put the rope around your neck, you will remember the names of the women who brought you here. Our names are Louisa and Esther Vance. Say them." He said them. He said them all the way to Santa Fe. That night in Black Hollow was the 17th capture in a career that would eventually total 41. 41 men dragged alive or carried dead across the deserts and canyons of the American Southwest by 2 women the newspapers couldn't agree how to describe. The Arizona papers called them the Vance twins. The Texas papers called them the Black Furies. The Mexican papers, writing in Spanish, simply called them Los Gemelas, the twins, as if no other word was needed. The men who hunted bounties for a living called them something else. The reason they had decided to try a new line of work. To understand how Louisa and Esther Vance became the deadliest bounty hunters the frontier had ever seen, we have to go back nearly 20 years. We have to go back to a place called Rosewater Hall, on the banks of the Yazoo River in Mississippi. We have to go back to the night their mother was taken, because that's where the girls named Louisa and Esther died, and the women who would replace them were born. The year was 1856. The place was a cotton and indigo plantation called Rosewater Hall, owned by a man named Percival Dunmore. Percival Dunmore was what neighboring planters called a man of taste. He imported French wine. He played the violin badly but loudly. He collected books he never read, lining his library walls with leather-bound volumes meant only to impress visitors. He also owned 147 human beings. Percival Dunmore didn't whip his slaves himself. He considered it beneath him. He employed a man named Silas Thorne for that. Thorne was a sinewy, red-bearded Georgian who had drifted west looking for work and found his calling at Rosewater Hall. He carried a bullwhip tipped with small lead beads, and he believed, as he often said aloud, that a slave who didn't bleed at least once a month was a slave who had forgotten who owned him. Louisa and Esther were born at Rosewater Hall in the spring of 1852, identical twins indistinguishable to everyone except their mother. Their mother's name was Harriet. She worked in the laundry house behind the main mansion near the kitchen gardens. She had been a laundress since she was 12. Her hands were permanently cracked from lye soap. Her back was permanently bent from the wooden wash paddles. But her voice wasn't bent. Her voice could still rise. Harriet had been born on a South Carolina plantation and sold to Rosewater Hall when she was 19. She had been married once on that South Carolina plantation to a man named Jubal. When she was sold, Jubal wasn't sold with her. She never saw him again. She didn't know whether the twins were his daughters or the daughters of an overseer who had visited her cabin too many times in her first year at Rosewater. She chose to believe they were Jubal's. She told the girls so every night. Your father was a strong man. She would whisper in the dark of their cabin, holding them both against her chest. He could read. Did I ever tell you that? He taught himself by looking at feed sack labels. He told me once that the day was coming when black folks would read every book in the white man's library. And that day would be the end of the white man's peace. Remember that. Your father said the end of their peace was coming. Louisa and Esther were inseparable from the moment they could walk. They finished each other's sentences. They got sick on the same day and recovered on the same day. They dreamed the same dreams and woke at dawn to tell each other, giggling, that they had met again in the night. Harriet watched them and was terrified. She understood something mothers of single children don't always understand. Twins were valuable on the auction block. Twins were a novelty. Twins could be sold together for a premium to wealthy buyers who wanted matched domestic servants, or sold apart for cruelty, to break them and see which survived the separation. Harriet prayed every night that her daughters would be forgotten, that Percival Dunmore would never notice them, that they would grow up quiet and small and useful in ways that didn't attract attention. The girls didn't grow up quiet. The girls didn't grow up small. By age 6, they were already working. They carried baskets of wet laundry from the wash house to the drying lines. They scrubbed the kitchen's stone floor on their hands and knees. They shelled peas and snapped beans until their fingertips ached. They ran errands for the house servants, darting between the mansion and outbuildings like a pair of dark sparrows. And they watched everything. That was what the other slaves noticed first. The Vance twins watched. Where other children looked at the ground when a white person passed, Louisa and Esther looked at the white person's hands, hips, and eyes. They counted the mansion's windows. They memorized the overseer's schedules. They knew which house dogs would bark at a stranger and which would sleep through a storm. They didn't speak of what they saw not to anyone but each other. Their first real lesson in what Rosewater Hall actually was came when they were 7. A field hand named Moses had tried to run. He had made it nearly 20 miles before the dogs caught him in a cypress swamp. They brought him back tied across a horse, bleeding from where the dogs had torn his legs. Percival Dunmore ordered a demonstration. All slaves, house and field, were gathered in the yard between the mansion and the slave quarters. Silas Thorne stripped Moses and tied him to a wooden frame. He whipped Moses 100 times. The girls stood in the front row because Harriet was in the front row and kept them close. Harriet tried to turn their faces away. Silas Thorne saw her. He stopped mid-stroke. Let them watch, Thorne said. Let them learn. A slave who doesn't see what happens to runners is a slave who runs. He made Harriet turn the girls' faces forward. He made them watch every stroke. Moses didn't die that day. He died 3 days later from fever in his open wounds. He was buried in the unmarked corner of the plantation where slave graves went, and the white family never mentioned him again. But Louisa and Esther remembered. That night, curled together on their straw pallet, they whispered in the dark. One day, Louisa said, I'm going to kill a man like him. Esther said, one day we are going to kill a man like him. They were 7 years old. They meant every word. The thing that set the Vance twins on the path that would eventually take them to Arizona happened when they were 10. It was a Sunday in June of 1862. The war between North and South had been raging for over a year. though the slaves of Rosewater Hall only knew about it through fragments of conversation overheard in the mansion. That Sunday, a visitor came to Rosewater Hall. His name was Colonel Augustus Finch, an officer in the Confederate Army. He had come to discuss purchasing supplies for his regiment, and he had come to look at slaves. The Confederate Army was impressing black labor to dig fortifications and build roads, and Colonel Finch had the authority to requisition workers from the plantations he visited. Percival Dunmore didn't want to give up any of his field hands. Field hands were money, field hands were cotton. Field hands were the engine of Rosewater Hall, so Percival Dunmore offered the colonel a different arrangement. He offered Harriet. Harriet was 34. She was still strong. She was a skilled laundress, and the colonel's regiment, Dunmore argued, desperately needed skilled laundresses. He would loan Harriet to the colonel for the duration of the campaign. When the campaign ended, Harriet would return to Rosewater Hall. In exchange, the colonel would leave Dunmore's field hands alone. Colonel Finch agreed. The twins were told nothing until the morning Harriet was taken. A wagon pulled up outside the laundry house before dawn. Harriet was ordered to gather her belongings. She had almost none. She wrapped a spare dress in a square of cloth and walked out to the wagon. Louisa and Esther followed her barefoot in the clothes they had slept in. "Mama," Esther said. "Mama, where are you going?" Harriet knelt in the yard's red dirt. She took one daughter in each arm. She pulled them close. Her face was calm. Her voice was calm. The twins would remember later that this calm was the most terrifying thing they had ever seen. "I have to go with the soldiers for a while," Harriet said. "I will come back. Do you hear me? I will come back. But while I'm gone, you two will take care of each other. You are not Louisa and you are not Esther. You are Louisa. And Esther, one thing, one heart, don't let anyone tear you apart. Do you hear me?" "Yes, Mama," they said together. "Say it. Say your promise. One thing, one heart." "And what do you remember?" They remembered everything she had taught them. They chose the thing that mattered most. "The end of their peace is coming," Esther whispered. Harriet kissed them both on the forehead. She climbed into the wagon. The wagon pulled away down the long oak-lined drive, and the twins stood in the dust watching until it disappeared. Harriet did not come back. 6 months later, word reached Rosewater Hall that Colonel Finch, his regiment, had been caught in a skirmish near Corinth, Mississippi. The camp followers, including the laundresses, had been caught in the crossfire. Some survived, some didn't. The colonel's adjutant sent a brief note to Percival Dunmore listing the losses. Harriet's name was on the list. Percival Dunmore read the note at breakfast, shrugged, and threw it in the fire. The twins learned their mother was dead from a field hand who had been in the kitchen when Dunmore burned the note. She had seen the name before the paper caught. She came to the laundry house that night and sat with the girls and told them the truth because she believed they deserved to hear it from someone who loved their mother. The twins didn't cry, not that night, not the next day, not for many weeks. What they did was begin to plan. The planning took 4 years. Louisa and Esther understood with a clarity rare in children that escape from Rosewater Hall wasn't something you attempted. It was something you prepared for. Moses had attempted escape. Moses had died tied to a frame in the yard. Dozens of others had attempted over the years. None had succeeded. The swamps were full of snakes and quicksand. The roads were patrolled by patrollers, mounted slave catchers who earned bounties for every runaway they returned. The dogs could follow a scent for 40 miles. Attempting wasn't the goal. Succeeding was the goal. They began by gathering knowledge. They listened to every conversation in the mansion, pretending not to understand, pretending to be simple. They learned the Yazoo River flowed into the Mississippi, and the Mississippi flowed south to a place called New Orleans, where the Union Army had taken control. They learned the war was going badly for the South. They learned Union soldiers had been sighted in counties not far from Rosewater Hall, and that some enslaved people who reached Union lines were being declared free. They learned to read. This was dangerous. Teaching a slave to read was a crime in Mississippi. Learning to read was punishable by whipping, by branding, by having a thumb cut off. The twins didn't care. Their mother had told them their father had taught himself from feed sack labels. They began with feed sack labels. They graduated to the newspapers Percival Dunmore left on his veranda. They would sneak onto the porch in the hour before dawn, the only hour the house was truly silent, and sit on the floorboards spelling out words by the light of the oil lamp Dunmore had forgotten to extinguish. They learned what a general was. They learned what a proclamation was. In January of 1863, they learned what emancipation meant. They learned emancipation had been proclaimed and that they technically were free. They also learned no one at Rosewater Hall seemed to care. They began to steal. Small things at first, a paring knife from the kitchen, a length of rope from the stable, a flint, a tin cup, a wedge of hard cheese. They hid their thefts in a hollow space beneath a loose board in the laundry house floor, a spot no adult had reason to look. They stole money. Silas Thorne kept a small leather purse on a shelf in the overseer's cabin. He didn't count it often. Louisa slipped in on a Tuesday afternoon, while Thorne was in the fields, and took $3 silver. He never noticed. Over 2 years they took 20, $1 silver and 47 smaller coins. They stole clothing, trousers, a shirt, a second shirt, 2 pairs of sturdy boots taken from a dead field hand the week before his burial, when no one was yet thinking to inventory his belongings. The twins cut their hair short in secret, hiding the cuttings in the ashes of the laundry fire, because they had decided that when they finally ran, they would run as boys. They stole a gun. This was the hardest theft and took the longest to plan. Silas Thorne owned 3 pistols. Percival Dunmore owned 7. The house servants had access to none. The twins watched for 11 months before finding their opportunity. In the summer of 1866, Dunmore's younger brother came to visit. He was a drunkard who had fought in the war and come home broken. He arrived with a worn capand ball revolver that he set on a side table in the front hallway when he went to bed the first night, and never picked up again during his entire 3-week visit. On the morning he left, he forgot it entirely. The revolver sat on that side table for 2 more days before the house servants noticed. Esther noticed first. Esther took it before anyone else could. No one ever mentioned it again. Percival Dunmore's brother was the kind of man who lost things. His wife wrote a letter a month later asking if he had left a revolver at Rosewater Hall. Dunmore wrote back saying no. The matter was closed. The twins now had a gun. They didn't know how to use it. They had no bullets for it. Only its weight in their hands and the knowledge of what it represented. They kept planning. The war had been over for a year by the summer of 1866. Slavery had been legally abolished by the 13th Amendment. And yet, at Rosewater Hall, almost nothing had changed. Percival Dunmore had gathered his workers in the yard shortly after the war ended and announced they were now free, but couldn't leave because they owed him for the food he had fed them and the shelter he had provided during the war. The debt, he said, would take several years of labor to work off. Anyone who tried to leave before the debt was paid would be treated as a thief and hunted down as a thief. This was a lie many Southern plantation owners told in those years. It was the beginning of what would eventually be called sharecropping and debt peonage, a system designed to preserve slavery under a different name. Most people at Rosewater Hall didn't know the law well enough to argue. Some who did argue were beaten by Silas Thorne, who had kept his job after the war because the work was still the work. A few had tried to leave and been returned by local sheriffs who somehow still considered Percival Dunmore's word law. The twins had read the newspapers. They knew Dunmore was lying. They owed him nothing. They had been born his property and had never agreed to any debt. But they also understood that knowing a truth and surviving a truth were 2 different things. They kept planning. The thing that finally forced their hand happened in October of 1866, just after the twins had turned 14. Silas Thorne had begun to notice Esther. He hadn't noticed her before. To him the twins had been a single, indistinguishable unit, small and forgettable, a pair of laundry girls who kept out of his way. But Esther, in the months before her 14th birthday, had grown. She was tall now. Her mother's cheekbones had appeared in her face. Her hands had grown long and graceful. Silas Thorne began finding reasons to walk past the laundry house in the afternoons. He began speaking to her directly when he passed, instead of addressing the older women as before. He began smiling in a way that made the other women in the laundry house go quiet. Louisa saw it first. Louisa always saw things first. She came to Esther one night in their cabin and said without preamble, "Thorne is going to do something soon. We can't wait any longer." Esther knew her sister was right. She had felt it herself, a change in the air, a tightening of a rope neither had fully understood was around their necks until now. They set the date, 3 nights away, the new moon, the darkest night of the month. They spent those 3 days doing everything normally. They washed the linens, they hung them to dry, they answered yes, ma'am, and yes, sir, in the voices they always used. They ate the same cornbread and salt pork they ate every night. They said their prayers at the same time as always. And on the 3rd night, when the plantation had gone quiet and only the whippoorwills sang in the trees along the river, they took their hidden sack from beneath the laundry house floor, put on their stolen boys' clothing, pushed their short, cropped hair up under stolen hats, and walked out of Rosewater Hall forever. They didn't look back, they didn't need to. Everything they were leaving behind they carried with them. The first week was a nightmare. They moved only at night. They slept in fallen tree hollows during the day. They ate the cheese and hard biscuits they had stolen. Then wild muscadine grapes from the canebrakes. Then nothing at all for 2 days. They stayed off the roads. The roads belonged to the patrollers, and the patrollers, despite the end of the war, were still active in Mississippi, still hunting black people who traveled without written permission from a white employer. The twins had no such permission. They had only themselves. They crossed the Yazoo River on the 4th night, swimming with their sack held above their heads, their stolen revolver wrapped in oiled cloth to keep the powder dry. The current was strong. Esther nearly drowned. Louisa pulled her out on the far bank by the collar of her stolen shirt, and they lay together in the mud for an hour, breathing, unable to move. "We are not going to die here," Louisa said finally. I refuse too," Esther said. They got up and kept walking. On the 7th night, they came to a small farm set back from the main road. A single light burned in the window. They were starving. They had run out of water 2 days before. They had reached the limit of what 2 14-year-old girls could do on their own strength. They watched the farm for an hour. They saw only one figure move inside, an old black woman. They took the chance. The old woman's name was Priscilla Hayes. She had been born free in Ohio, moved south after the war with her husband, a Union Army veteran, to help establish a school for freed people. Her husband had been murdered by night riders 3 months earlier. She stayed on the farm anyway because she had nowhere else to go, and because leaving felt like letting the night riders win. Priscilla Hayes opened her door to 2 starving girls dressed as boys, saw through the disguise in about 3 seconds, and said, "Get inside before someone sees you." She fed them. She let them sleep in her loft. She asked no questions for 2 full days. On the 3rd day, when they had regained enough strength to speak, she sat them down at her kitchen table and said, "Now tell me who you are and where you're going." They told her everything. It was the first time they had spoken their real story aloud to anyone but each other. It took hours. Priscilla Hayes listened without interrupting. When they finished, she sat for a long moment in silence. Then she said, "You can't go north. North is where everyone is running. The patrollers are watching every road north. You need to go west." "West," Louisa repeated. "West," Priscilla said. "Past the Mississippi, past Texas if you can manage it. Out to the territories. The territories are lawless in a way that can kill you, but also lawless in a way that can save you. There are black folks out there already. Buffalo soldiers, cowboys, people who went west during the war and never came back. Out there, nobody knows who you were. Out there, you can become who you want to be." "How do we get there?" Esther asked. "You're going to need more than you have," Priscilla said. "You need a real story. You need to learn things you don't know yet. You need to stay with me for a while. A winter, maybe. I can teach you some of it. The rest you'll have to learn on the road." The twins stayed with Priscilla Hayes for 7 months. She taught them to shoot. Her dead husband's Spencer carbine and 2 Colt Army revolvers were still in the house, and she had plenty of powder and ball. She had learned to shoot from her husband, one of the first black men in his Ohio regiment. She wasn't a great shot, but she was a good teacher, and she taught them the fundamentals: stance, breath, squeeze, don't pull, reload without looking. She taught them to ride. She had 2 mules and an old cavalry horse her husband had brought home from the war. The twins had never been on a horse in their lives. They fell off 100 times. They got back on 101. She taught them what she knew of the country west of the Mississippi. She drew maps in the dirt with a stick. She named the rivers they would have to cross. She named towns where a black traveler might find a bed, and towns where a black traveler would find a rope. She gave them the names of 3 people she knew in Texas and 1 in New Mexico who might help them if they could reach them. She taught them to pick a lock, a strange skill for an old schoolteacher's widow to possess. But Priscilla Hayes was full of surprises. She taught them never to trust a white lawman, never to trust a black lawman who worked for a white one, and never, under any circumstances, to let themselves be separated in a strange town. "You are twins," she said. "That is your strength and your weakness. Together you are 2 guns, 2 sets of eyes, 2 minds thinking the same thought. Apart you are half of what you should be. Stay together. Whatever happens, stay together." On the night before the twins left, Priscilla Hayes gave them her husband's gun belt, the Spencer carbine, both Colt revolvers, the cavalry horse, and 1 of the mules. She refused to take any money. "Your mother would have done the same for my children if I had any," she said. "Now go, and when you get where you're going, do something that matters." They rode out at dawn the next morning, heading west. They were 15 years old. They had no idea the woman who had taken them in would be dead within a year, burned out of her farm by the same night riders who had killed her husband. They had no idea the gun belt they now wore had been in 3 battles, and killed at least 4 Confederate soldiers. They had no idea the name Vance, the name their mother had whispered to them as their father's name, was about to be spoken in towns Priscilla Hayes had only sketched in the dirt. They only knew what their mother had told them: 1 thing, 1 heart, and the end of their peace is coming. The journey from Mississippi to Texas took the Vance sisters 4 months. They moved slowly because moving slowly was the only way to stay alive. They avoided towns, main roads, rivers with bridges because bridges had toll keepers, and toll keepers had questions. They crossed the Mississippi on a ferry run by a drunk Cajun who took their money and asked nothing, the only kind of ferryman they were willing to pay. They traveled as boys. They had cut their hair shorter before leaving Priscilla's farm, wore their stolen trousers, shirts, boots, and wide-brimmed hats, and spoke in low voices when they spoke at all. Most of the time they didn't speak. 2 quiet black boys on a thin horse and a mule heading west with nothing visible to steal weren't interesting enough to rob. That was the idea anyway. It worked most of the time. It didn't work in eastern Texas. 3 men on horseback rode up on them one afternoon in the pine woods east of Nacogdoches. The men were white. They were dressed like drifters in the grayish leftover Confederate coats many ex-soldiers still wore in 167 because they owned no other. One carried a shotgun across his saddle. "Boys," the one with the shotgun said, "where you 2 heading?" "West," Louisa said, her voice as low as she could make it. "West where?" "West Texas, going to work cattle. Our uncle sent for us." "Your uncle?" the man repeated. He smiled, showing black teeth. "And who is your uncle?" "A man named Washington." Esther said the first name that came to her. "He runs cattle near the Brazos." The 3 men looked at each other. The one with the shotgun kept smiling. "Boys," he said slowly, "I don't believe you have an uncle. I believe you're runaways. I believe somebody back east is missing 2 head of property, and I believe that somebody is going to pay us good money to have you returned. The war is over," Louisa said. "There is no property anymore." "The war is over where you come from, maybe. The war isn't over here. And even if it was, there's always somebody willing to pay for a strong back and a young set of hands. Now, you two are going to get off that horse and that mule nice and slow, put your hands on top of your heads, and we're going to take a ride. The man with the shotgun had made two mistakes. He had assumed the twins were boys. He had also assumed the twins would hesitate. Louisa drew from the saddle. Esther drew from the hip. Both colts came up at the same instant because the twins had been drawing at the same instant since they were 15. Since the first time Priscilla Hayes had made them practice it in her barn. The man with the shotgun was dead before he finished his sentence. The second man managed to get his pistol out of its holster before Esther's second shot put him on the ground. The third man spun his horse and tried to run. Louisa shot him out of the saddle at 30 paces. The twins sat on their own animals for a long moment, breathing, their revolvers still in their hands. The pine woods were very quiet. A single crow called from somewhere. They climbed down. They checked the men. All three were dead. They had never killed before. Esther sat down on a log. Her hands were shaking. Louisa sat next to her and put an arm around her shoulders. They sat that way for a long time. Is this what it's going to be? Esther said finally, I think it's what it has to be. Louisa said, they searched the men. They found $37 in silver and paper. They found a decent Colt Navy revolver, which they kept, and 2 wore. Nout pistols, which they didn't. They found a half-eaten side of bacon. They found a flask of whiskey neither had any interest in drinking. They found, in the pocket of the man with the shotgun, a folded piece of paper. Louisa unfolded it. She read it twice. What is it? Esther said, it's a bounty notice. Louisa said, these men were bounty hunters. She held the paper out. Esther took it. Esther read it. The notice was for a Mexican man named Rafael Ortega, wanted for cattle theft in Louisiana. The bounty was $100 dead or alive. The twins looked at each other. They made a living doing this. Esther said slowly. They rode around with a piece of paper, found men and brought them in for money. They tried to do it to us, yes. But imagine if we were the ones carrying the paper. Imagine if we were deciding who the paper was for. Louisa thought about this for a long moment. She folded the notice carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. We would need the right man to teach us, she said. Priscilla said there was a man in New Mexico. She did. She said his name was Obadiah Freeman. She said he rode with the Buffalo Soldiers during the war, left the army after, and lived somewhere past the Pecos River. Then that's where we go. They took the 3 dead men's horses. They buried the bodies under a thin layer of pine needles because they didn't have time or tools to bury them properly, and because they didn't feel the men deserved better. They rode out of the pine woods with 5 animals instead of 2, with the dead men's $37, and with a folded bounty notice tucked against Louisa's heart. They were 16 years old. They had just become something new. The man Priscilla Hayes had named lived 300 miles west of the pine woods, in a small adobe house on the Pecos River, just south of what the Mexicans called the Llano Estacado, the Stake Plains. Finding him took the twins another 2 months. Obadiah Freeman was 50, one when the Vance sisters rode up to his house on a warm April morning in 1868. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, gone to some softness around the middle, but still imposing. His hair had gone white at the temples. He wore a reissue Spencer carbine on his back and a Remington revolver on his hip, and he had a long scar running from outside his left eye down into his beard. He had been born free in Philadelphia in 1817, the son of a schoolteacher. He had read law as a young man but never practiced because no court in Pennsylvania in 1840 would admit a black attorney. He had worked as a printer instead, setting type for an abolitionist newspaper. When the war came, he enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, the first black regiment in the Union Army. He fought at Fort Wagner. He survived. Most of his friends didn't. After the war, he drifted west. He spent 2 years with the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, as a civilian scout and interpreter. He spoke passable Spanish and a little Comanche. He left the army in 1867 because he had grown tired of white officers who gave stupid orders and blamed black troopers when the orders failed. He settled on the Picos because the Picos was far from everything. He raised a small herd of goats. He grew beans and corn. He read whatever books came into his hands, which wasn't many. He wasn't lonely exactly, but he was alone, and he had made peace with being alone. He watched the twins ride up from 2 miles off. He had seen the dust long before he could make out the figures. By the time they came within hailing distance, he was sitting on his porch with the Spencer across his knees, his way of greeting all visitors. They stopped their horses 20 paces from the porch. Louisa raised one hand, palm open. "We're looking for Obadiah Freeman," she called. "You've found him. Who's doing the looking?" "Priscilla Hayes sent us." Obadiah Freeman went very still. He lowered the carbine slowly to the porch boards and stood up. "Get down off those animals," he said. "Get in here. There's shade and water. We'll talk." They spent 3 days at Obadiah Freeman's table before coming to the reason for their visit. The first 2 days were about eating. They had been on the trail for 4 months. They were thinner than they had been at Priscilla's farm, and Priscilla hadn't exactly fattened them up. Obadiah cooked beans, cornbread, and goat stew, and didn't ask a single real question. He let them eat and sleep and sit in the shade of his cottonwoods and recover from the road. On the 3rd evening, after they had finished the dishes, he lit a small fire in the yard, and the 3 of them sat around it, and he said, "Now, why did Priscilla send you to me?" They told him. Everything, the way they had told Priscilla. Rosewater Hall, Silas Thorne, their mother taken by the colonel and never returned, the planning, the running, Priscilla's farm, the 3 men in the pine woods, the bounty notice folded in Louisa's coat. When they finished, Obadiah Freeman sat for a long time looking into the fire. "And what is it you think you want to do?" he said finally. "We want to do what those men in the woods tried to do to us," Louisa said. "We want to carry paper. We want to bring in men who deserve to be brought in. We want to make a living from it." "And Silas Thorne," Obadiah said, "and the men who took your mother to the army, are they on this list?" The twins looked at each other. "Yes," Esther said. "I thought so." Obadiah leaned forward and stirred the fire with a stick. "Let me tell you something. I've been a soldier, a scout, and a lot of things, and I've killed men in several of those roles. What you're talking about isn't soldiering, it isn't scouting, it's a trade. It has rules. Some are written on the warrants you carry. Most aren't written anywhere. A bounty hunter who doesn't understand the rules dies young. Do you understand?" "Yes," they said. "Do you know why I'm asking?" "Because you're thinking about whether to teach us," Louisa said. Obadiah Freeman smiled. A small smile that didn't last long. "That's exactly right," he said. "I haven't taken a student before. I never planned to, but I'll tell you something. I've watched 2 girls ride up to my house after 4 months on the road with 5 horses and enough coolness to keep the reins steady when a stranger raises a carbine. I've listened to a story that should have broken both of you, and I've watched neither of you cry in the telling. You're already something. The question is what you want to become." "Bounty hunters," Esther said. "That's what you want to do. I'm asking what you want to become." They thought about this for a long time. The fire burned down to coals. "We want to become the last thing bad men see," Louisa said finally. Obadiah Freeman looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Then we'll begin tomorrow." The training lasted 3 years. Obadiah Freeman didn't believe in pain as the best teacher. He believed in repetition. He believed a skill wasn't a skill until your body could perform it without your mind supervising. He believed bounty hunting wasn't about being the fastest or bravest, but about being the most prepared. The first year, he taught them the country. He rode with them across West Texas into New Mexico territory, down into the Chihuahuan Desert. He showed them the water holes and the dry washes that looked like water holes but weren't. He showed them the trails the Apache used, the trails the Comanche used, and the trails white men thought were the only trails. He taught them to find a campsite from a day and a half behind the campers. He taught them to read a hoofprint and know whether the horse had been shod in St. Louis, Santa Fe, or Mexico. He taught them to tell by the way a man rode whether he was armed, and by the way a man slept whether he expected trouble. The country was the thing, Obadiah said, Every gunfight he had ever won, he won because he knew the ground better than the other man. If you knew where the shadows fell at 4:00 p.m., you knew where to stand. If you knew which way the wind blew in the canyon, you knew which way the sound of your horse would carry. The man who understood the country didn't need to be the fastest gun. The man who didn't could be the fastest gun in the world and still die. The second year, he taught them the guns. The twins had arrived as decent shots thanks to Priscilla. Obadiah made them into something more. He had them shoot until their shoulders ached from horseback at a canter. Standing, kneeling, lying on their bellies, left-handed until their left hands were nearly as good as their right. He had them practice drawing from a holster, from a saddle scabbard, from beneath a coat, reloading in the dark, reloading underwater in a shallow stream he dammed up behind his house because, he said, a day would come when they'd need to. He taught them the knife, the rifle butt, and the revolver butt, how to choke a man silently and break a man's knee with a boot. He taught them the best fight was the one that didn't happen because you had arranged things so the other man had no options but surrender. The second best fight lasted less than 10 seconds. The third year he taught them the trade. This was the part the twins hadn't expected. The trade of bounty hunting. Obadiah said, is 90% paperwork and 10% shooting. A bounty hunter who can't read a warrant, can't tell a real one from a forgery, can't write a receipt, can't present a captive to a federal marshal in a way that gets the marshal to pay instead of stealing, that bounty hunter will die broke if he lives. He taught them to read a warrant, to write a good hand because their hand marked them as educated, and educated black bounty hunters were less likely to be cheated than those who signed with an X. He taught them about territorial courts and federal courts and how they did and didn't cooperate, which marshals were honest and which were not. He told them always bring captives in alive if possible, because a living captive could testify they had treated him by the book, and a dead captive couldn't defend them from murder charges. He taught them something else on the last night of the third year. They sat around the fire, the three of them, as on the first night. The fire was small, the night was cold. The twins were 19 now, no longer the girls who had ridden up to the adobe house 3 years before. Something harder and leaner, faces more like their mother's, eyes more like Obadiah's. There is one more thing, Obadiah said, and it's the most important thing. You are twins, that is your weapon. No one else in this country has what the two of you have. No two men, no matter how close, think the way you two think. No two men draw at the same half-second. No two men finish each other's sentences. I want you to understand what that means. We do understand, Louisa said. No, Obadiah said. You understand it from the inside. I'm telling you how it looks from the outside. When you walk into a room together, a man with his wits about him sees one threat, because that's what his mind is trained to see. He doesn't see two threats operating as one mind. By the time he realizes what he's looking at, he's already dead. That's your advantage. Protect it. Never let anyone separate you. Never ride into a town one at a time. Never sleep where you can't hear each other breathing. The day someone gets between you is the day you start to lose. We know, Esther said. Our mother told us the same thing, one heart. Then your mother was wiser than most men I've met, Obadiah said. Listen to her. He reached behind him and brought out a small wooden box. He opened it. Inside were 2 matching badges. They weren't real lawman's badges. They were something Obadiah had made himself out of sheet silver years before for reasons he had never fully explained. They were shaped like 6-pointed stars. Each had a single word engraved across the center, Vance. I don't know when I made these or why. He said, I think I was lonely. I thought maybe I would have children one day and wanted something to give them. I never did. These have been in this box for 15 years. I want you to have them. The twins took the badges. They didn't speak for a long moment. Wear them on the inside of your coats, Obadiah said. Not on the outside. You aren't lawmen, you're hunters, but you're also sisters, and you carry your family's name. And when you walk into a saloon to collect a man, I want you to know that somebody Made something for you once because he believed you were going to matter. They rode out the next morning. They never saw Obadiah Freeman alive again. He died 5 years later, peacefully in the adobe house of what the doctor in the nearest town called simply Old Heart. He left the house, the goats, and the cottonwoods to the twins in a will written in his own neat hand. They buried him on a rise overlooking the Pecos and kept the house for the rest of their lives as a place to go when the road became too much. But that was later. In the spring of 1871, they were 19 years old, with their first warrant folded in Louisa's coat pocket, riding east along the Pecos to find a man named Elias Crowder. He had robbed a stage near Las Cruces and killed the driver. The territorial government was offering $300 dead or alive. They brought him in alive in 11 days. That bounty notice was their first. That man was their first delivered captive. The $300 was the most money either had ever held. They took it, rode to El Paso, bought new coats, new boots, a second rifle, and rode out again to find the next name. They didn't stop for nearly 5 years. The legend of the Vance sisters grew the way all frontier legends grow. In saloons, in sheriff's offices, in newspaper stories half wrong and half invented, which the twins never bothered to correct. In Tucson, they were said to be sisters of a Union general. In El Paso, former slaves of a Mexican land baron who left them half his estate. In Deadwood, where they had never been, they were said to have killed 11 men in a single gunfight. The truth was less dramatic and more impressive. Between 1871 and 1875, Louisa and Esther Vance captured 41 wanted men across 5 territories. 33 were brought in alive, 8 were killed resisting arrest, in every case confirmed by the federal marshal receiving the body. They never lost a captive to escape. They never took a bounty not backed by a legitimate warrant. They never shot a man who had laid down his gun. They never separated from each other, not for an hour, not for a minute, in 5 years of continuous work. They made enemies. The white bounty hunters of the Southwest were not pleased that the most efficient team in the trade was 2 black women who had been slaves 9 years earlier. Some told themselves it couldn't be true and refused to believe it even when their own friends brought stories. Some believed it and decided something needed to be done. In the summer of 1873, 4 white bounty hunters led by a man named Jack Coulter rode into a town called Piedra Blanca in the New Mexico territory looking for the Vance sisters. The twins were there to collect a bounty on a horse thief. They had delivered him to the deputy marshal and were sitting in the cantina eating dinner when Jack Coulter and his men walked in. Coulter didn't waste time on conversation. He told the twins to stand up and walk out with him. He said the horse thief's bounty was his, not theirs, and he was going to collect it and they were going to leave town. Louisa, who did the talking when she felt like doing the talking, set down her fork. She looked at Jack Coulter for a long moment without answering. Then she said, "Mr. Coulter, we have already delivered the man. The marshal has already paid us. If you have a complaint about who the bounty belonged to, take it up with the marshal." "I'm not taking anything up with anybody," Coulter said. "I'm telling you to give me the money and get out." Esther, who did the watching when Louisa did the talking, had already counted the men. 4, including Coulter. 2 had their hands near their guns. 1 stood by the door, probably to cut off retreat. The 4th was behind Coulter's left shoulder, clearly second in command. Esther had also counted the other people in the cantina. 11, 3 women, 8 men. 6 of the men were Mexican laborers who wanted nothing to do with this. 1 was an Anglo drummer in a suit edging toward the back room. The last was the bartender who had a shotgun under the bar and a face suggesting he would use it if things went bad for the twins, and not for Coulter. Esther stood up from her seat on Louisa's left. She did it slowly because slow was less provocative than fast, and because slow let her move her right hand down to the hem of her coat without Coulter noticing. "Mr. Coulter," she said, "you have made a mistake. You are going to walk out of this cantina with your men, get on your horses, and ride south. You are not going to ride north, east, or west, because north, east, and west are the directions my sister and I travel, and we are not going to share a road with you. Do you understand? You don't talk to me, Coulter said. I'm talking to you. I'm going to kill you in about 3 seconds. You are not. My sister is going to kill you. I'm going to kill the man behind you. My sister is going to kill the man to your right after she kills you, and I'm going to kill the man at the door. After I kill the man behind you, that's what is about to happen. You can stop it by walking out of here. You have until I finish the count of 3. 1. Coulter reached for his gun. He never touched the grip. Louisa's first shot took him in the throat. Her second shot took the man to his right in the chest. Esther's first shot took the man behind Coulter in the forehead. Esther's second shot took the man at the door in the stomach because he had already started to turn, and a headshot was no longer clean. The cantina was silent. Smoke hung in the air. The bartender slowly took his hand off the shotgun. The twins holstered their pistols. Louisa put a silver dollar on the table for the dinner. They walked out past the bodies without looking down. Word of Pedro Blanco traveled faster than the twins did. By the time they reached the next town, the story had grown. Coulter's 4 men had become 6. The twins had become invincible. By the end of 1873, no white bounty hunter in the Southwest was willing to cross the Vance sisters for a bounty, even if he believed it was his. It was simply not worth it. The twins, for their part, never spoke of Pedro Blanca. They didn't talk about their kills. They didn't keep a count. They didn't brag. They simply rode, collected, delivered, and moved on. But the twins had a count, even if they never spoke it. The count was in Louisa's pocket, written in small, careful letters on a single folded piece of paper. It had been there since they left Rosewater Hall. It didn't list the men they had killed in the course of business. It listed the men from Rosewater Hall: Silas Thorne, Percival Dunmore, Colonel Augustus Finch. And below those 5 more names: men who had been present the day their mother was taken, men who had stood in the yard and let it happen. Overseers, a neighboring planter, the old house doctor who had examined Harriet and pronounced her fit for service with the regiment. 8 names. For 5 years, the twins didn't go near any of them. They had decided early in their first year, under Obadiah's teaching, that they wouldn't hunt their own targets until they had become the best hunters in the territory. They had promised Obadiah they would finish their training first. They had promised themselves they would never come at those men as amateurs. By the end of 1875, they were no longer amateurs. They were the deadliest bounty hunters in the West. It was time to go home.